Okay, welcome everybody to this research seminar. I'm very happy to have Wendy Wong here, who's going to speak about We the Data, Human Rights in a Digital Age. Wendy is a professor of political science and principal researcher at the University of British Columbia, a lovely place. Got her PhD from another lovely place, University of California, San Diego. And I think you spent some time at my alma mater too, University of Toronto.
Almost 15 years.
15 years.
Yeah,
It's not a bad place either.
Almost.
And I mean, you have been writing quite a lot about global governments with a special attention to non-state actors, such as Amnesty International. I think you wrote your PhD about that. Now you turn to a very, very important area, namely how technologies like artificial intelligence, big data, and how that connects with human rights and even humanitarian assistance. And you recently published this book, We the Data, Human Rights in a Digital Age. And that's what you're going to talk about.
That's what I'm going to talk about.
So the floor is yours. Very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Gustav, for both the introduction and the invitation to speak, and for all the wonderful staff here at IFFS. It's been really smooth and lovely. So I am going to be talking about this book, We the Data, today. And it is actually a book written for a general audience. It's not written for a specific academic group, although it draws very heavily on many fields of study, mostly from outside of my own specialty of political science. I'm an international relations researcher, but I drew actually much more heavily on other social sciences. I drew heavily on law. I looked at technical writing and some humanities fields as well in the process of writing this book. And I wanted to make it accessible, but also bring my point of view into this, which is that I talk about data from the lens of human rights. And that's something I've worked on for 2 decades in the context of thinking about global governance and the work of non-state actors in developing international human rights. And so in the process of doing that, I've thought a lot about collective action and what motivates people to agitate, and what makes them successful and what makes them unsuccessful. So, I really think that the point of the book is very conceptual, and it makes the argument that speaks to the fact, I think more generally speaking, that governing AI is really also about thinking about data problems. It's not just thinking about regulating algorithms. We need to really think about AI as a data problem as well. And of course, AI is a topic that gets headlines almost every week, perhaps even every day, sometimes it feels like. So when I first started writing this book in 2019, AI was not as predominant in headlines as it is today. But one of the things that I think is critical for understanding AI is what makes AI possible. And so if we can break down AI into its 3 component parts, right? So one part is the algorithm. That's the code. That's what, it's what tells the computer what to do. But we also have to think about the compute, the computing resources that go into enabling some of the really sophisticated and large algorithmic models that power some of the most well-known AIs out there. And we also need to think about data, because current models, current large language models in particular, and other generative AI models require tons and tons of data. And most of those data right now are actually data about human beings. Okay, so this is really a question about how AI, or a book about how data and data that powers AI systems is really changing the way we live our lives and experience our lives as human beings. And I would say also that I'd like people to think about data as a human rights issue going forward, from some of the things I'll be talking about today. So as I said, this came about in 2019, and of course we all know that after 2019 and 2020, our lives fundamentally changed for a few years due to the pandemic, but we also all went online to do things that we would have done face to face. So it was kind of like a nice is the wrong word, but it was a very well-timed experiment to think about how we became much more datafied, much more digitized as a result. So what I do in my talk is, and I'm going to structure it around 5 takeaways for today, but I'd like to start off with a ghost story. I'll actually tell you 2 ghost stories. One is definitely a ghost story, and the other one we'll see what it is, but I like to call them ghost stories. So this is Roman Mazurenko here in the picture. He was a young tech entrepreneur living in Russia in the 2010s, and unfortunately in 2015, on an unseasonably warm November day, he was hit by a car and died. Now, usually when we die, This is sort of a way to, when we all die, we kind of get cut off from the living, right? We don't no longer communicate with the living. And when people continue to seem to communicate with the living, we say they're ghosts, right? So, whether this is moving furniture or whispering or creating cold spots, that's what ghosts do. Roman, as a ghost, actually texted. He was able to text. And so, after he died, he was sending texts, or actually was able to respond in text form to people who talked to him. And the reason he was able to do that was because of the technology of the other person pictured in the photo, Eugenia Koida. She was one of his close friends. She is also a tech entrepreneur. She has actually created a product called Replica AI. This actually became quite popular during the pandemic. Replica AI is an AI friend app. But at the time, she was working on the technology behind this product, and she missed Roman quite a bit because he was not actually very good at updating his social media. He did not have a gravesite. So she used her existing texts with him, as well as texts donated from other friends and family. So in total, about 8,000 texts that Roman had exchanged when he was alive to create a bot based on Roman. And from all accounts of people who knew Roman in life, this bot sounds a lot like Roman. So it worked, okay? And this might sound like a one-off, but actually, Roman's chatbot fits into an ecology that people have called the digital afterlife industry. Usually, this is about dealing with people's data after they die, okay? What data gets left behind. But as I'll talk about today, in terms of the stickiness of data, what I call data stickiness, the digital afterlife industry and the way that data stick around isn't just about what happens after we die. It's actually about how we live and how our everyday activities have really become datafied. And the chapter from which this anecdote comes from is actually on. It's available for free on the IEEE Spectrum website. They excerpted part of this chapter because I think it's something that really captures a lot of people's imaginations, especially when we think about the sort of how we deal with mortality. And that's a classic human question, of course. Now, I'm going to tell you another type of ghost story. Okay, this is maybe less of a ghost story, but still, I think it's another way to think about data ghosts as we're living. It's a little less morbid. I think it's more about how we live our lives as opposed to what happens after we die. So, Roman's chatbot is about a literal ghost, I suppose, that was produced through data. But there are also data ghosts, or ghosts of our data, powering the everyday technologies that we've now come to understand as AI. So this is a pretty well-known data-powered exchange from February 2023. This is with the New York Times reporter Kevin Roose talking to the Bing chatbot, which of course was powered by ChatGPT. They had a very long conversation. He actually wrote a number of articles about this, including the transcript of their conversation. By the end of this conversation, Roose reported feeling creeped out because the bot named Sydney actually declared its love for him and was trying to convince him to leave his wife. And so this was a very odd exchange if you think about human relationships. People usually don't do that on the first digital date, okay? But what I think struck Roose and what really got the internet going on this issue was that surprisingly, Sydney sounded human. But of course, if you think about how AI systems or how LLMs work, they're based on the data of millions and millions of human exchanges, right? So it's no surprise that a bot based on all of these text exchanges created by human beings sounds like human beings. Okay, so this is something to think about these are two stories to think about as I talk today, to consider what it means to live in a world in which data actually does not die in the same way that people do. So first, if digital data can be used to recreate people in the ways that we might, in different ways, including Roman's story that we might imagine, what does this mean about the relationship between data and human life? To the extent that human activities and existence are becoming data, what are our responses? What is possible going forward? And I think second, more closely related to human rights, thinking about how the rights that have been established globally since the end of World War II are now being tested sometimes violated, I would say, in a social context in which data-intensive technologies are ubiquitous. They're all over the place. We carry them around, and they're on our desks, on our wrists, in our homes. And data collection has become a way of life in many social institutions. So how do we think about how human rights can actually help us design better governance structures going forward in this data-intensive age that we find ourselves in? Okay, so as I said, I structure my talk around 5 takeaways. And it's really not surprising to think about data about people or data being taken from people in this context that we find ourselves in. And it feels like, there are all these headlines about how large language models are using data in unauthorized ways. There are lawsuits that are happening. We ourselves in our exchanges online may have become free fodder for something like ChatGPT. Sometimes it feels like we can't but help be part of this system. There's no way out, right? We have no choice. And some of us might feel that we're actually victims in this, that we're caught up in a society where the way our lives are structured and organized is around digital interactions and around our data-intensive devices. We depend on the internet for daily business, for social interactions, for cultural interactions in some cases. And even if we don't have smartphones, or even if we try to minimize our digital interactions, we're still in the system of digital data collection, right? So if you tap into public transit, that's a way that your activity is being monitored. If you patronize stores here, I don't know if you have loyalty programs here, but in North America, we have lots of loyalty programs. That activity is being tracked. Some of those stores you go to use facial recognition technology. So there are ways that your purchase histories are being analyzed. If people have video doorbells on their homes, every time you walk by one of those houses, your gait, sometimes your voice, your face is all being captured. Okay, so we have all these different ways that we have become data. And so this has been called datafication from the media studies and communications literature. This idea that digital data is really capturing some of our most innermost behaviors and feelings and thoughts. These are all becoming data. Okay, they're not just behaviors that are observed. But another way to say this is that a big chunk of our lives concerns data now, or is becoming data. And so that's a really different way to think about living a human life. And one of the consequences of this, as I was alluding to before, is that we might feel like data subjects. In fact, that's how we're talked about in a lot of both regulation and the way that companies talk about us as users of their products, is that we're data subjects. Data are being taken from us, but we have very little to say about whether that happens or not. These sort of click consent models are simply ways to give us something to do before we download that app. So we have very little choice but to be subjected to such data collection. And what I'd like, the biggest theme from this book is probably to think about how we can flip that script a little bit, right? Instead of being data subjects, I think it's really important to think of ourselves actually as data stakeholders, because that's really what we are in the process of datafication. And human rights is an important way to get us to stakeholdership. But I think it's also important to really acknowledge that to make data about people, you need 2 interested parties. You need 2 parties. One is the data source, right? So you need all of us. All of us are doing things and thinking things that become data. We are the source. And the other party is the data collector, right? These are the companies that are providing us with the apps or the devices that generate the data about us. So, powerful data collectors like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, and Meta. And so, to be a stakeholder, one of the things that, of course, comes from thinking about collective action and social movements is how to make your voice heard, right? How to get acknowledgement that your position is important and legitimate. And that's, of course, quite difficult if you think about the difference between the number of data sources in the world, billions and billions, and the number of data collectors in the world, far less than billions and billions, right? Depending on how you want to think about who is an important data collector. But I think the other barrier that's really stood in our way to understanding how we are actually stakeholders is that most of the discussion around data about people has revolved around an economic relationship. Okay. So data are not talked about as intrinsically human, they're talked about in terms of the market. So either data is as valuable, if not more valuable of a commodity than oil. Okay, we were told that for a while. Or data is actually inherently not valuable, right? So think about it as a byproduct. I'm sure you've heard of terms like data detritus, data exhaust, or data dust. Okay. So it's either one of these things, but somehow there's a market value attached. And of course, everyone likes to say, if you're not paying for it, you're the product. Okay. So these are all fundamentally about economic relationships. But we know that human life is not just about the market, right? Humans have political relationships, they have social relationships, they have cultural relationships that we draw on, and also are mediated by a lot of these technologies. And so if we want to think about a full human life and how fully datafication actually affects us, we should be thinking about something beyond the market. And so this is where thinking about, okay, what else could we base our relationship to data on? Thinking about human rights. Human rights is actually one of the only globally endorsed frameworks that many people and all countries in the world have signed on to in one way or another. And I think this is really the basis for having stakeholdership. Right? Stakeholdership means having skin in the game. It means having some kind of stake in what happens. And we do already. It's so being a data stakeholder means acknowledging that stake that we already hold and then feeling entitled to speak up, right? Feeling entitled to act and not letting data collectors direct the trajectory of how data collection practices and data analysis practices go forward. Now, this all sounds well and good, but there is a major barrier to doing this. Okay, and that's because data are sticky. And when I talk about data stickiness, I really do mean sticky like gum at the bottom of your shoe. I think that's a really good analogy in the sense that we've all had that feeling, right? We come home and we realize there's a big wad of sticky stuff on the bottom of our shoe, and it's really hard to take that off once it's on. The other thing is you don't really know where you got that gum from, but somehow it's now with you and it's a problem that you have to resolve. I think it's very similar in that sense to think about datafication. It's not that hard to generate data about what we do. It happens through our sort of normal day-to-day activities, but it's really hard to get rid of those data. And then I would say that on top of that, we have to think about the difference is thinking about how useful those digital data have become, right? Digital data are important because they're easily copied and transferred, that they reduce transaction costs, they make it easier for us to transmit information. So they're useful. But when they are about people, right, they're also sticky in ways that are problematic. The first way they're sticky is that data are really about mundane things. They're not about extraordinary things. They're about things that are everyday, your normal activities. And so that means that it's actually quite difficult to change those activities and those habits, okay, or to be even conscious of some of those activities and habits. So you might be able to change your commute pattern, you might be able to change your purchasing pattern, but you can't, I mean, most people don't change their faces in dramatic ways, right? But facial data is that your face is quite mundane. It's an everyday way you interact with the world. It's an everyday way you acknowledge your own identity. So in a way, most of the data about us are very normal. They are who we are, okay? The second reason why data are sticky is that they're linked. So this is just acknowledging that, you know, when a data collector makes data, they don't just keep those data in isolation. They're using those to merge with other data sets that they have, to sell and to buy new data, to find more insights, right? And nowadays, it's really cheap to grab data and archive data. So there's an incentive to hold on to lots of data and link it when it becomes useful or not. And we can think about data linkage as having positive and negative effects. So for example, in the medical field, which often has data protections to prevent certain types of links, there are ways to think about how, if we link data together, it could lead to better detection for certain types of cancers, for example, or thinking about using AI in ways to help remedy, you know, different diseases like sickle cell anemia. But that can also lead to discrimination against those very conditions, right? If we start linking those data together. And so we have to think about how linking is sticky into both positive and negative ways. The third reason data are sticky is that they're effectively forever. So once data are made, we don't know where they go. We don't know who has them. We don't know if we've ever deleted the thing that we find problematic, okay? And so, and this is, because they're easily transferred and copied between users, but also because they endure, and we don't really know what endures and what doesn't. That's not really transparent to us as data sources. The final reason why data are sticky is precisely this data source and data collector relationship, what I call co-creation. Okay, so this is to point out that new data, as I said earlier, data about people are about a sort of relationship between a data source and a data collector. So data don't exist in nature. They have to be created by somebody. So data collectors make choices about what to collect and how to collect those data and what to use those data for. And we're the data sources. We are there to be observed, right? And to be recorded. And so without either party, you have no data about people. In a practical sense, this actually really makes it difficult to decide whose data they are. They're about you, they're about me, but we didn't actually make them in a complete sense, right? We didn't actually have a 100% role in making them. So that's one way to think about co-creation and why data are sticky, because there are at least two claimants to their sort of existence. The other way is also to think about the collective versus individual nature of data. So when we think about why data collectors make data about people, they're not actually interested in you or me as individuals. They're interested in people like you and people like me. So inherently, data collection is experienced individually, but the implications are always about the collective. And it's a collective that we often can't know or don't know because algorithmic sorting is proprietary. And so we may not know who is like us according to some set of weights that a company has put on the data analysis. So you have to think about how data are co-created in sort of the two ways that I've outlined here and why that poses problems. Now, I want to be hopeful here. I want to think about how we can combat this idea, or at least use human rights to think about how we can assert stakeholdership in this digital age. And I think human rights are a really useful tool because of what I said before, that really the only globally endorsed framework we have out there for thinking about morality or ethics, but also because I think there's some useful concepts and lots of legal frameworks around which to work here. So the political scientist Jack Donnelly, who has written one of the most important human rights textbooks out there, really highlights that human rights really are about what we might become. So it's important to think about how they help us think about human potential. So not what human life is experienced like necessarily, at the time right now, but what it could be, what it should be perhaps. So when as an international relations scholar, I tend to focus on the post-World War II period for human rights, right? I think about the beginnings at the international level, which really many people focus on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 as like the cornerstone for thinking about international human rights. And so after years of negotiation, the state delegates to this document came up with 30 articles around which the subsequent human rights framework has been built. Okay, and they came up with a lot of important norms. First of all, that international human rights are universal. It's important that they're universal, they are unconditional in their application, and they are interdependent. And they also made it clear that human rights are about states' responsibility. Right? States are the enforcers of human rights, they are the protectors of human rights, and unfortunately, they're also the violators of human rights. Okay, so that's built into the human rights system at the international level. And there are lots of different human rights. Some of them you might be very familiar with, such as the freedom of expression or the freedom from torture. But there's also the right to education, the right to choose your marriage partner, and the right to a fair trial, for example. Now, since the UDHR came about, there have been lots of human rights treaties at the global level, so through the UN, but also regionally here, as you all know, in Europe, but also the Americas, and other regions. And so it's a really thick ecosystem of legal protections that have been developed or that have come about since the 1948 UDHR. Now, why I say all this is that I think because human rights have developed so quickly and because there's so much to human rights, I think it's actually important to think about not the specific rights, but how they fit together and why they have come about. Okay, so here's an image from Marianne Glendon's book on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is what's called Renee Cassin's portico. So at the time of the UDHR, they had come up with this long list of different rights, and the framers really wanted a way to articulate how they fit together. Okay, to show the world this is why we have all these different rights crammed into this one document. And so Cassin came up with this idea that all these different rights that were present fit into this nice framework, right? We have different types of rights. So some of you might be familiar with civil rights versus political rights versus economic, social, and cultural rights. There's a roof of the temple. That's sort of the reason we have human rights is the sort of fellow humanity that we seek to create, and why we have duties to one another. So this is a nice articulation of the document. But what I want to point you to is actually the bottom of the picture. This is the foundation of the building of human rights. So even at the time of the UDHR, what was really important to the framers was to include values that actually undergird the human rights system right from the beginning. Okay, and these are values that are familiar to all of us because they remain important today, and they're unresolved in some ways, right? In the sense that there are lots of ways to think about these terms. So we can talk about dignity, for example, as the worth, right? Inherent worth of human beings. That's really what dignity is about. So not just being inherently worth something because you're human, but being treated as though you have this inherent worth. There's also this idea of equality, right? Which is the desire simply to be treated the same as other people, to be compared to the same baseline, to not have different baselines for different people. Now, in the book, I talk about autonomy, not liberty. But both of those words really are about being unencumbered in the world. And the reason why I choose autonomy and not liberty is because autonomy also implies agency. So it's one thing to be free. It's another thing to be able to act on that freedom, to be able to act as an agent in the world. And so I really wanted to emphasize that. And the last value, unfortunately, brotherhood is quite gendered. So I chose the word community because I think it reflects the same idea, which is we're in a common situation, right? We're in a common humanity, there's a common sociality, and it's not just about individuals. It's actually about some group of humans. And so these values, like thinking about these values of dignity and equality and autonomy and community, they really haven't changed. But we can also think about the ways in which they might be at odds with each other, right? This could be a moral conflict, so to speak, right? So, and this is the point of politics. It's to say that deciding which value matters or which values we need to prioritize versus others is exactly the point of politics. And it's exactly why actually human rights is an important political construct. And so, we might say, okay, the framers of the UDHR, they didn't think about digital rights, right? That this didn't even exist at that time. They were thinking about physical constraints and physical limitations on human flourishing, on human well-being. And so what we really need to think about is how human life has become both physical and digital. Not either. They're not separable. They're actually intertwined, and they affect one another. And so how we think about these four values is really critical for understanding how we might govern something like social media, for example. Okay. The next takeaway I want to talk about is big tech. So we're all used to thinking about multinational firms, what we can, call big tech. These are the leaders of the digital economy. They're really wealthy. So we often focus on how historically wealthy they are. A lot of them have valuations into the trillions. Okay. But money is really, from a political science perspective in particular, money is just one way to exercise power. It's not the only way, right? And I would argue that big tech's creations, the way they have, what their inventions and innovations are, is actually going far beyond this economic influence. They really influence the way we live. And that's something that we tend to associate with states. Why? So when we think about states, we think about governments, right? Governments. Governing, what is governing? It's creating order around shared expectations. So doing so, creating this order around shared expectations often means setting rules, and it means finding ways to enforce those rules so that those rules stick. So we've come to understand that governing as an activity is what governments do. It's sort of implied by the way we talk about those two phenomena. But I would argue that it's become sort of not, we would be out of step not to think about what big tech also does to govern all of us. They, after all, create and control the digital platforms through which we access services and through which we find social and political connections. And people talk about this as platform governance. And I think this is a really important point because it's not just thinking about the interactions. For example, Meta, as we know, has 4 prominent platforms that they own. So Facebook and Instagram, but also WhatsApp and Messenger. And on Instagram and Facebook, Meta exercises control over the community standards, right? So they have a say over the sort of the general content of what applies on their platforms. So that's one thing. And if we think about that, even just that one aspect of governing free expression, Meta products reach, depending on who's counting, 3 or 4 billion people, right, around the world, which is a lot more than any government really can legitimately claim to govern, okay? But on top of that, Meta actually has an oversight board. And this oversight board uses human rights frameworks, actually international law around human rights, to judge the content that should be removed or kept on its platforms as well. And so it's actually exercising governance in a different way, not just through community standards, but actually using rules that technically don't apply to them because, as I said earlier, human rights responsibility falls on states. Okay, businesses like big tech don't have responsibility. They have to respect human rights. Okay, but what if they don't? Then it's up to states to deal with that, except when states and businesses are in conflict. So, I live in Canada, and, in the past year or so, or 2 years, there's been a lot of conflict between big tech companies like Google and Meta and our government, because the government wants these companies to compensate journalistic news outlets for the way that Google and Meta's platforms drive links to this content. And the companies, of course, were resisting this kind of payment. As this project developed, Google did come to a settlement with the government, but Meta did not. Okay, and this actually happened also in Australia as well. A different type of dynamic. Australia also wanted payment from platforms that were redistributing news content, and companies in that situation actually blacked out some of the content and threatened to leave Australia. So that is really how I think it's important to think about the way that big tech is actually governing, and it can come into conflict with governments in doing so. Now, the last takeaway I want to talk about is data literacy. Okay. So I argue in the book that one of the ways forward is to start thinking about data literacy as a human right. Right, and I'll talk a little bit about why I say that here. I think it's a very complex topic that requires a lot more investigation, but at the same time, I think it's really important to identify data literacy as something that many of us lack and to give it the status of a right as opposed to, gee, it's nice to have data literacy. Okay. I think without data literacy and its accompanying, the accompanying concepts like AI literacy or media literacy, we really end up putting ourselves in the situation where we might just continue generating the dysfunctional social outcomes that we currently have, because some people have data expertise and AI expertise, and most of us are not data or digitally literate or don't have AI literacy. So I think also data literacy is a key to becoming a data stakeholder. Okay, to really think about how data play an important role in our lives and how data are used to shape the way we behave in society. I personally do not think human life will become undatafied. Okay, so I think data centricity is the way forward. And so instead of ignoring it, we should really acknowledge that key skills and key concepts, key conceptual skills, I would say, about what data are, how to make data, how to use data, and the implications of creating digital data versus non-digital data are really important core human experiences at this point. They're key human conceptual frameworks to understand our world. And I think this is why literacy is an important way to think about it, because literacy is not about expertise. Right? Literacy is about competence and functioning and understanding. So we need to have these basic understandings about how the world is shaped around us and how we can perhaps shape the world in a datafied way, right? Not just, we can't get by with analog skills anymore, or just with analog skills anymore. So this is really not about making more data scientists. It's about making all of us data competent, okay? And there are a lot of ways to do this. So some countries in Europe, for example, are leading the way in terms of thinking about how to teach things like media literacy and data literacy. So countries like Denmark and Estonia, for example, have come to the forefront in terms of thinking about how to change curricula. And I know in Sweden also there are programs that policymakers are trying to implement that offer support for teachers, for example, in the classroom with regard to data and digital technologies. But I think it's much broader than that. I think if we, the kids are important, and it's important to sort of going forward. We need kids to be armed with these sort of literacy skills. But I think it's also about thinking about how communities can support people who aren't in K through 12, right? Who aren't involved in sort of this kind of more formal education. And so in the book, I do focus on the role of the public library. And especially in North America, the public library has been critical for fostering linguistic literacy, right? For helping people learn how to read, for teaching skills around the importance of reading and why this is something that as a citizen we have to have as a skill. And so libraries already know how to run mass literacy campaigns. And on top of that, just thinking about the role of the library in society really makes it clear that they should be data stewards, because libraries take raw materials, right? They literally take documents and books and other objects, they categorize them, they add order to them, and then they make them accessible to the public, right? They make them reachable, they make them understandable, and librarians know an awful lot about their collections. They are really good at sorting through data. And in that sense, it's really important to think about them not as, stodgy collections of old. We're not leaving books behind because we're now in the digital age. It's that libraries are actually data stewards, and they should be funded as such, and they should be thought of as such, as something that is, as an institution that is both well trusted and also well positioned to help us with the transition to the digital age. So to conclude, I don't think that human rights are the silver bullet. That's not the point, right? But the point is that in order to think about the challenges of datafication, in order to grapple with some of the governance questions that have come about, either before governments or even just thinking about how to develop norms around social media uses, we really need to think about autonomy and community, equality and dignity. Those are key values that I think will get us started in thinking about how to move forward. I think to move forward, we also need to come to grips with the collective nature of data, right? So we tend to think about data as individual, as choices we have, but I think there are implications that go well beyond our individual selves that really need to be grappled with, because it's not just the types of data I talked about, or the sort of the individual experience versus the collective implications for data. I think it's also about some types of data are literally co-created. Think about DNA kits like 23andMe, very popular in the US. I don't know how popular they are in Sweden, but many people have purchased these kits. Well, DNA data is inherently shared. So even if you yourself have not participated in this, if you know someone who has, who's related to you, then you are in the data set by default. And this is something that you have no real way to control ever, right? So I think it's really important to think about some data being collective just by their nature as well, which brings me to my the point that oddly, the sort of collectivity of data actually makes collective action quite challenging. So when we think about collective action problems, we're usually thinking about why doesn't this collective act together to get the goals that they seemingly should have, or that why is it that some groups can act and others don't, even if they have similar motivations, at least from observation. The collective action problem in the age of datafication is that the collective is actually often unknown. Okay, so it's not even about why don't they act, it's why don't they know who they are? Because if you think about collective action in the classic sense, usually people know who they are and then they choose to act, right? So groups are self-identified, right? Think about all the activist groups that are out there. They acknowledge they have common interests or some kind of common values, and they get together and they either act or they don't. They either succeed or they don't. Today's collectives, and the collectives that affect your experience of life and my experience of life, are often algorithmically derived. And we're not privy to those algorithms. We don't know who else is in this category of people like us. And yet these collectives, this people like us category, has real effects on how we experience our world. So this is an important, I think, challenge going forward for thinking about how we might create new collectives that we actually explicitly acknowledge and are part of. Now, and just on this final point, because data are effectively forever, because we can't verify that they aren't, so they are effectively forever. I think the other thing we have to think about is the human implications for having data floating around about us, about our very most mundane behaviors, effectively for a very long time, in that these data may be useful, but the unintended consequences for recreating people, I think, really has resonance both for living and for beyond. And those are both implications for human communities that we'll have to grapple with going forward. So thanks so much for listening.
Thank you very much. So we're getting into the question and answer period. We're going to record the first half hour. And for the audience here, just put up your hand for a new question and a finger if you want to follow up to somebody. Oh, that was quite a lot of hands. And also for you online, you just write in the chat and you can write hand or it's a new question, or if you want to do a follow-up question, write who you're following up to. And do please also tell us what discipline you are, since we are a mixed crowd here. Now I see all these hands, so where should I start? So, yeah, Kari, you're getting a microphone.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Kari, I'm a media scholar. Thank you so much for a very interesting and important talk. Yeah, I have so many questions, but I will limit it. So I would like to ask if you could say something more about, like, why is it important to talk about these basic values rather than specific human rights? So I'm trying to understand, like, what's the basic argument here? I mean, is it a means to better understand the effects of datafication, you know, the harms and risks of datafication, or is it also a means to better come to terms with it or resist datafication, and how so in that case? And also, I guess, related to that, I mean, the notion of data stakeholders. What does it mean to become a data stakeholder? I mean, is it again mainly about awareness, knowledge, insights, or is it also about like concrete tactics to resist datafication? And it's also related to this. I better pose all the question. Like, you know, how do you also see a need for a more systemic approach to come to terms with datafication in terms of legislation and regulation? Because, you know, we do have now the new Digital Services Act, which is exactly an attempt to protect.
Sorry, you keep talking. I'm going to grab this.
to protect, you know, fundamental rights of users of platforms and search engines and so forth. Yeah. Thank you.
No, those are great questions. Should I answer them in the order? Do you want me to answer them in order or as like grouped together? Okay. Okay, great. No, these are thank you, and thank you for those questions, Kari. Like really important ones, and I think ones that really strike at the heart of this project. I think that we need to talk about basic values because a lot of what I see that's been labeled human rights and AI related has focused on privacy. And I think privacy has become a term that is overused and also because it's overused, it's actually got so much in the definition that I think it's really hard to think about what it actually means. What are we protecting? So why do I say that? In Canada, the way that we think about facial recognition technology has, or limiting facial recognition technology use has fallen under the office of the Privacy Commissioner. That seems to be the only tool right now that can be used. But if you think about facial recognition, it is a biometric data point, right? It's biometric data. Biometric data has a special place of protection for most governments. But faces are not private, right? Faces are social. So when we think about the human face and its importance for social interactions and for self-identity, there's a mismatch between this idea of privacy around the data about the face and then yet the use of faces in human life. And so I think the idea, the sort of focusing on existing rights and how they do or don't apply, I think it leads to these sort of quandaries where you have something that seems just to be inappropriate. I actually think it's more important to think about facial recognition as of technologies and accompanying facial data as a violation of dignity, for example, because it treats human beings as not human, right? This is you're sort of violating some kind of inherent worth when you're storing a bunch of faces in a database or you're harvesting faces from social media and other internet sources. It's about autonomy, of course, when we think about surveillance and the use of facial data. It's about equality because we know that facial data is there are biases against certain minority groups in different countries. You know, where I come from, it's indigenous people and it's Black people, right? That's typically the groups that you're going to get a lot of inequality in the use of facial data. And it's about community. Who's in this data set? How are those data being used? You know, in our other conversation, we talked about other countries, you know, subjecting certain populations to facial data, so basically mandatory facial data storage. So I think it's a real concern for those values. And if we can talk about it in those terms rather than privacy, I think we can get a little bit farther because otherwise facial recognition is often thought of as a security issue. And then it becomes security versus privacy, as opposed to how about facial recognition threatens all these different things about human life that go beyond privacy. In terms of the stakeholder idea, I think this is a starting point. So I don't know what tactics come with stakeholdership. I think this is where I go back to my old social movements thinking. There are lots of different tactics, right? And I think it depends on the groups that are involved and what things they choose to advocate for. But I also think it's important to think about ourselves in an identity sense as stakeholders and not as subjects. And I think that's an important step for governments to recognize as well, that when they talk about data subjects and different regulations, they're talking about people, right? They're talking about people who have an active stake in the data collection that they're participating in. And on the question of systemic approach, I'm one of these people that does not have a book that says, and this is the chapter where you take all these different actions to protect yourself. You know, there are other authors who've done that, and I happen to believe that that's sort of a false comfort. I'm not sure what you personally can do. You know, sometimes I'm asked, should I give up my phone? I'm not giving up my phone. You know, I may not get other types of devices, but I wouldn't give up my phone for any number of reasons, including that I can't remember my own calendar without my phone. I do think that, therefore, the impetus should be on governments. I think governments have really gotten a short shrift here. I think they're often accused of being slow and stupid. And, you know, frankly, democratic governments should be pretty slow, right? They represent our interests. And so I would be worried about a democratic government that acted very quickly on AI. On the other hand, I also think that governments have probably misdirected a lot of their efforts into trying to chase the developments of what I would say are algorithmic development. So these new models that come up, you know, right? So since the EU AI Act was first drafted, they had to take into account generative AI because that was a brand new thing and foundational models. And you're chasing something that is evolving much quicker than the speed of democratic governance. In a recent piece in The Conversation, what I argue is that there are other parts of AI. So don't chase the algorithms, chase the data, because actually governments are really good at data. They invented data collection on people, essentially. So why not pursue regulation around something that governments already have quite a bit of expertise in? I'm not saying governments should make more data about people, but what I'm saying is that governments have been forced to develop guardrails around certain types of data through human rights movements, through other forces, that make them, I think, well positioned to consider what's important for us in terms of thinking about the implications of data collection. And certainly, they are in a position to demand more of companies and not make it so easy for companies to collect data about individuals.
Happy with that. No, good. Then we go to Christer.
Hi, I'm Christer. I'm a philosopher.
Hi.
Thank you. This is actually sort of a related question, and it relates to your sort of view about the human rights as sort of aspirational, I think, in a way, sort of what we could be and perhaps ought to be, rather than actually requirements or claims against certain parties. And I'm thinking about the Article 12, which of course is one of those privacy ones, right? No one should be subject to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home correspondence, and so on, right? And they have the right to protection of the law against such interference. Isn't that sort of important part here, right? That, yeah, actually some parts of this sort of data management is actually violating human right, and we have a claim. And we have a claim against the state, actually, to protect us. Sure. And it's good to be able to refer to the specific rights rather than just aspirational basic values, because we all agree, of course, it's good with dignity, equality, and so on, right? But what does it mean concretely when someone feels violated, right? And the privacy seems to be an arbitrary interference, right? I think it's good to actually be able to identify certain specific rights, and privacy is one of those. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why it's become the focus of so much of the human rights discussion around AI and around datafication. I mean, I have a few responses to that. One is that I think they're using the word privacy is very problematic, even within North American context, because people have different thresholds for what they want people to know, right? So some people will want to share everything and some people don't want to share anything. In sort of the broader context around privacy and sort of the more European context, right, we want to think about privacy in terms of autonomy as well. Like, how are you able to act or not act as a result of different privacy protections? And I think people have different conceptions of that we don't talk about necessarily explicitly. We just say privacy is important and therefore we need to protect it. I think the other thing is that, you know, that article that you read is about arbitrary interference, and it is about basically trying to stop the state from coming to your house without a warrant and searching. The problem is that most of the technologies that are the most invasive in terms of privacy, if we want to think about it either in terms of autonomy or breaking the barrier as it were, are things you bring into your own home, right? So you are voluntarily bringing your cell phone into your house. You bring and you use it, or you're using your Siri, or you're using your Alexa, and you bring that in. So how do we think about that in terms of this unwanted interference? Is it because we don't understand the technology? Is it because technological creators have not been very forthright in the way they describe what the data collecting capacities are? And still, I think, I've heard people say, yeah, it's okay that Alexa listens to me all the time as long as it can turn on my music and like do the things I want it to do, tell me the weather. Some people are willing to make that trade-off without thinking about the deeper implications of that kind of trade-off. They see the convenience trade-off. And so I do think it's worth going beyond the specific right. I'm not saying the specific rights don't matter, but we can't just stop there. And I think that is actually my concern, is that, at the time I was writing this book, a philosopher, Carissa Valise, wrote a book about privacy, right? And in that book, she offers a lot of helpful advice about protecting privacy. But a lot of what's missing in that book, from my view, is that you can get a VPN all you want, but is that actually resisting this massive system of datafication that goes outside of what you can actually control in terms of privacy? It doesn't change the way that data collection happens, outside your own little sphere. And I think that's problematic. There are ways that we can't control data collection that is actually quite revealing about who we are.
Thank you.
Very good. So then we jump to Ludwig.
All right, thanks for a great talk. Well, my first point was very much to Kari's and Krister's. I won't sort of get stuck in this, although I think that might be helpful with a sort of stronger explanation for why we should look into the values of human rights rather than the rights themselves. That's the sort of conclusion I take from this discussion. Okay. But it was one thing you said also about human rights, which is that they don't apply to corporations. But that was a bit confusing, because later on you said, well, they do have an obligation not to violate human rights.
They have to respect human rights.
Yeah, you have to. But that's the same thing, isn't it?
Legally, it's not.
Yeah, you have to respect them. The way to respect them is to not to violate them, isn't it?
Yeah, but then it's not so ultimately the responsibility for respecting human rights falls to states. So if you have a rights violating company, the person to enforce that, or the entity to enforce that, is the state.
But and you emphasize very much the idea that human rights apply to states, but I don't think that's true, actually. I think the subjects of international human rights law are not just states. It's also international organizations, it's also individuals, it's also corporations to some extent. And I think if you look into the literature on that, I think you will say that. I mean, take, for instance, the International Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It names that these are obligations for states, organizations, and individuals. It says that.
But who signs that treaty?
Well, states are signing it, but
the parties to the treaty.
Yeah, okay. Parties to treaties is one thing, but the obligations they generate apply also to others.
I mean, so I'm not an international lawyer, but it is an important distinction in law. Like, as a political scientist, I think that, of course, yeah, these human rights are general norms that many non-state actors have taken.
No, but legally speaking also. So so courts can actually hold organizations to account for human rights violations. I think that's the case, actually. It's to some extent. I mean, they're not having the same extensive obligations under human rights law as states have. That's true. And they're not parties to them. That's true as well. But they are still they fall under the umbrella of human rights law to some extent. So, yeah, okay. But none of us are experts in this field. So maybe we should leave that to the lawyers.
Have an expert here somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, look, my understanding is that states are the parties to these treaties, even if they have, even if it says like other organizations have to respect these rules or these norms. But what actually makes some of the additional protocols to a convention like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, so the human rights, what is it called? The committee that individuals can make complaints to for that treaty.
Human Rights Committee,
yeah,
HRC.
The Human Rights Committee, yeah. So that's actually a really significant move in that individuals have standing before that committee, right? But only if states agree to that. So actually the state parties don't have to agree to allow their citizens to stand before the Human Rights Committee.
No, but that is not a reason why it doesn't apply to individuals. Just as the states, okay.
I'm not saying it doesn't apply.
Okay.
So wait, I do want to say it's not that it doesn't apply, it's that there's not an obligation, right? And this is, but it is important to say that because states are the preeminent parties and protectors of human rights. And there's actually, the guiding principles on human rights are exactly trying to give businesses more responsibility, more of a, articulate more why businesses ought to be respecting human rights. But there still is in that document the fact that states have the responsibility to enforce that.
Okay, it's minor addition there. I think it's just important also to not focus too much on UDHR, the Universal Declaration. I mean, human rights has been an evolving set of legal norms. I mean, there's so many conventions that have been, and actually UDHR is just a declaration, but all the conventions that have been established after that, and as you mentioned, HRC and all the courts and regional documents like the European Convention and so forth.
Sure.
So it's a very living body of norms and values and rights that sort of that I think have sort of gone have progressed a lot from the UHD-HR.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Thanks.
Okay. Did you want me to respond to that?
No. I mean, just, but that's okay.
No,
so it's an implicit question there.
Right.
Why do you focus so much on UDHR?
I made a conscious choice to do that. Yeah, of course. I mean, I know, as I said in the talk, there's a rich ecosystem of human rights law out there. And it is developed in a very specialized way. I mean, this is why we can't, between the two of us, we actually do, what is the actual line between states and non-state actors with regard to human rights obligations or responsibility, which is a legal term, right? That is something that it has become such a specialized field. It requires international lawyers, international human rights lawyers to interpret that. And I respect that work. What I'm saying is that Datafication has affected all these different treaties. None of these treaties are written in the digital age. They're all analog, right? These are all physical constraints, physical problems, okay? So I could, if I was an international lawyer, I could go through and write a different book. And in fact, there are lawyers who are writing different books about AI and international human rights law. I think my focus as a political scientist, as someone who studies social movements, is to think about the UDHR because many activists actually don't look at the human rights law as it's written legally because it is a specialized field. They look to aspirational, non-specialist documents like the UDHR, not because they can't look at the legal stuff, but because that's a specific avenue for human rights activism. That's going to court. Going to court is not always a tactic that human rights activists follow. And so I think it's important to respect the fact that this document, the UDHR, although it is non-binding, has created an ethos, around respecting human rights that endures. And even today, with this thick ecosystem of human rights law, people still look to the UDHR. And I'm sort of asking us, let's look at why the UDHR exists to begin with. So it's even more back than what you said, and I fully acknowledge this is a choice, right? This is a choice that I made as a political scientist because I understand this document to have normative resonance in ways that the European Convention on Human Rights does not for a broader audience. Now, for lawyers, it's super important, and I take your point. Like I could have done it a different way, but I didn't. Yeah.
So now, the lady here in the front.
Hi, I'm Anna Näslund. I work at Stockholm University. I'm art historian, but I actually worked for the past 6 years on a project called The Politics of Metadata. It's about image collections in museums, archives, and libraries. So my question is tied to this, the library issue that you raised.
Yeah.
I thought it was wonderful how you described the library as an important place for fostering data literacy. But I just have a question adding on to this. Do you see that museums and archives have some similar role in the future or not? So yes or no? Thank you so much.
Great. Yes. right? Because they are also important arbiters of how we understand the world. I mean, they're making decisions all the time for what we see as history that applies to us or not. And I have an interdisciplinary team I've assembled with a computer scientist colleague at my university, Parang Irani, and we have a really interdisciplinary team of collaborators, one of whom is our university archivist, for the reason that we think, archivists are using AI technologies actually quite extensively, but also because they have to make really tough decisions about what is this document an example of? And, how do I place it within this giant file of documents about a specific topic or from a specific person? So I think archivists, perhaps even more so than your modern librarian who isn't assembling the library but has to understand the logic of the library, is creating order in ways that make information available and legible to the general public. So I think that we tend to think of museums and archives and librarians as relics from an analog reading past, but in fact they have so much to share and tell us about how to organize data, and how we think about the world is a very conscious set of decisions. And they, of course, are, I think, at the forefront of doing that. So absolutely. Yeah, thank you for coming. Yes, it was a long, long yes.
Okay, so we turn to the sociologist, Malcolm.
I have a rather general question. Conditional crystal ball, first go full dystopia here. What if we get this wrong? In the plausible scenario where we do quite poorly in sort of managing this.
And managing what?
Well, this whole landscape of data, or how we think about the relationship with human rights. What you're working on. I mean, what is it at stake in the sense of how? What do you worry about that we might really suffer from if we don't, in a sense, govern this new age we're living in appropriately in the kinds of ways you're talking about? But then one of the things I found interesting about your talk is you also articulated in, at various points, a kind of more positive vision, this sort of human flourishing, data is part of us, but we could sort of treat this as, I don't know, it almost felt kind of like a richness of human experience, a kind of emancipatory feature of our lives, that we could take advantage of these new technologies. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it felt like there was this sort of quite wide range of potential outcomes. And I'm talking like not just next year, I'm talking about like, our lifetimes, next generation's lifetimes. Can you go full utopia and tell me, like, if we get this really right, what do you think? What do you think about that?
That's a trick question because I don't think in those terms, right? I don't. But let's
study.
Yeah, I know, I understand. But I don't think in terms of
Feel free.
Utopia or dystopia. But let me go outside of my comfort zone and tell you why, what I think could happen, right? And also, you're asking why I wrote the book. Like, what's the problem here, right? Why is it that you decided to intervene? I mean, part of what I saw when I first started this project was a lot of long-term projection about a pretty grim human future that really devalued individual lives, but seemed to have some sort of promise for humanity writ large. So I'm talking about either, artificial general intelligence, AGI, where it was, yes, we're going to have the supercomputer that's going to do all the yucky things for us, I suppose, and human beings can be liberated. And live on universal basic income, and I don't know, sort of like a weird techno-Marxist vision of what happens when you're liberated, right? Or this AGI is going to turn us all into paper clips, right? And we're all going to be destroyed. Or we're just going to move to the moon because we can, and we're going to colonize the solar system. And all of these visions just seem to me to be very abstracted from human life, right? And I think if we get it wrong, I don't think that paperclip making machine is the future, but I think a future where human life is devalued and flattened into economic relationships and extractive relationships is the problem. I tend to be I don't know if optimist is even the right word. I tend to want to think that human life is beyond that, and I have I guess an impetus to try to protect that. or to try to articulate what's valuable about human life outside of the market. Even though the market's important, it's not the only way that we live lives. And people have richness outside of the market, including their own identity and their own social belonging in communities. So if we get it wrong, if we continue with the status quo, I think we kind of already know what's happening and what's happened, right? We've become data sources for infinite amounts of data collection, and now tech companies are starting to cannibalize themselves. I mean, this is, I don't know if I brought this up in an early conversation with you, but the New York Times recently reported, of course, that OpenAI started scraping YouTube videos, which is against the terms of use of YouTube. It's a violation of copyright. And they did it anyway because they need to feed their large language model. And I see that as a problem because it sidesteps established human rights norms, and just legal norms, because there are ongoing lawsuits against OpenAI with the New York Times, for example, suing them, right, for copyright violations. So I think that what I worry about also is the quick and rapid dissolution of well-established norms that we have, for better or for worse, and without a replacement. And so, human societies, governments, we move slower than these technologies do. And we are already grappling with the destruction of, I think, this norm of freedom of expression, which I think is an important idea. It's an important human right. It's an important norm. But social media has really changed how we ought to understand that, simply because we haven't figured out a way to balance both expression and then the toxicity of some of that expression and its rapid spread in a way that was impossible without digital technologies. And so we've seen this before. I think the printing press and the automobile are two other fundamental human experience changing inventions. One, the printing press took hundreds of years to play out, and we now retrospectively can trace democracy from the Gutenberg Bible, right? The automobile took decades to play out and is still playing out. So the effects of the internal combustion engine are not just, to the individuals in that car. It's the way that cities have developed in North America in particular. Los Angeles, where I'm from, is a car city designed around cars after a long, no, not even a very long conflict. But also EVs, right? Also driverless cars. These are things that are still playing out. It takes decades sometimes for what we call disruptive technology to really show all of its true consequences.
Very good. Back to the philosopher, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask a bit about your idea of a right to data literacy. Just curious, can you say a bit more to give us an idea of what you think is in the scope of that right? Like when you mention, classrooms and like teachers, what sorts of skills are being taught there? Like, what do you envision? You mentioned learning what data are, how to make data. I guess you would probably want to include something like teaching people how companies use your data so that they can make, I don't know, certain decisions. I don't. Could you just say a bit more about how you're envisioning
the
that?
content?
Yeah, the content.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thanks for that question. So it's some of it is conceptual. So thinking about data stickiness, and that's really about human data, right? Data about human beings, and thinking about what are the implications of creating data that stick around and in a way that we don't control but are in part about us. And we think about the collective, like how that affects us. So it is some of this stuff that you're talking about, but I think it's more basic than that, actually. It's understanding how data don't exist and have to be created. So all data are biased based on the creator's desires or creator's view of the world. So I think of the scholars Rahul Bhargava and Catherine D'Ignazio. They have started some community programs to teach kids precisely this. So it's not about digital data. It's actually just about data as a practice. So how do you make sense of the world? We are all making data regularly. We categorize things all the time when we go out, when we interact, when we're awake, right? We think about, it's sort of like an implicit function of the brain to make these categories. So I think it's important to really highlight how there's agency and choices, and every human has different biases towards different types of things. So one of the things that D'Ignazio and Bargov talk about is projects they do with kids where they have them come into the classroom and just ask them to make a data set about what people are wearing. Make data about that. And inevitably people pick out different things. And so they talk about that and why that's important and how their own perspectives color that different. So are you looking at types of clothes, like who's wearing a skirt, who's not wearing a skirt? Are you looking at stripes? What are you categorizing? Textures. And I think that is a really basic way to understand this is what data are telling me and what they're not telling me. And I think that is an orientation that is not present. I think when I say the word data, and this was not apparent to me until after I'd written the book and started talking about it. When I say the word data, people are like, oh, scary, right? Numbers. And I think it's really imperative that we think about data. Yeah, they are numbers because they're readable by a computer, but they're also concepts and they help us navigate the world. And that's not something that's alien to anybody. I think we're all making categories in data all the time. We just don't systematize it in a way that data sets are systematized. But that's something I think that we should start with. So it's really kind of basic. I know in Lithuania, they do activities with kids where they look at different cookies. Same thing, like actual cookies, not digital cookies, like actual physical cookies, and try to get them to think about what differences there are, what things they would highlight.
And in pushing for a right to learn things like that, or have that kind of education, you think it's useful to appeal to the general values that you listed in the Declaration of Human Rights: autonomy, equality.
Sure. I mean, I think that's, I think that as consequences of data collection, I think actually as a right, it is really important just to put that as something else that governments need to be pushing for and to actually provide resources for. I mean, that's really the important part, right? It's like when you declare a right, it's a different level of obligation for a state, right? Okay. It's a basic obligation that then creates entitlements for citizens to make claims against the state, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is why saying it's a right as opposed to an initiative or something that states should be thinking about is a different level of obligation for states.
Yeah, and those values seem to support something broader than just a right to data literacy. It sounds like they would support rights to all kinds of specific education on topics that affect us. And I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head, a right to like learn politics, right to history, and maybe that's a consequence you would welcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think the values I talk about are inherent in a lot of human rights, after all, because they're the foundation. But sometimes we get stuck on thinking about how a specific right might play out, instead of thinking about, well, why do we want that right to begin with? Like, what is so important about freedom of expression to begin with that losing some aspect of that in the digital world, or having that aspect changed, like having, the sort of boundaries around hate speech change? Why is that an important consequence of the digital age? And I think that really is a question, not just for thinking about freedom of expression, but also thinking about things like autonomy. What does it do to us as human beings?
On that point, join me and thank you, Wendy, for this lovely talk.
Thank you so much. Those are great questions. Thank you.
There are some upcoming talks on May 15th, that's next week. We have Josephine, who's a political scientist here, going to talk about cultural political economy and crisis of economic integration in Europe. And then on May 22nd, we have Olle Hammar, who's going to talk about, also a researcher here, rethinking global wealth inequality, the role of human capital. Like grand things. Thank you very much for welcoming them.